giving a keynote really about experiences of seeking to co-design tools for journalists to work in newsrooms. We have an expression in English, experiences from the coalface. This is very much experiences encountered in everyday work. And that is what Carl Gustav asked me to come back and talk about again. So this is largely a series of loosely connected stories and experiences that might appear slightly negative, but I have some positive messages towards the end. So as Carl Gustav says, I'm actually Professor of Digital Creativity as opposed to more general types of creativity at City University of London. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm also the Chief Product Officer for a startup called JetAI, which has been working in the news and media sector for the last 5 or 6 years, primarily to apply creative intelligence technologies to news and media. So the JetAI product, it's a web-based tool primarily, but I'll come on to other forms a bit later, which is designed to help journalists and editors think more creatively in order to discover new voices, new angles, new horizons for their stories and content. We've refined it so that the algorithms try to strive for gender balance and ethnicity balance in the voices who are recommended to journalists to talk to. So it's become quite a sophisticated tool, probably more sophisticated than we ever envisaged it. And our approach, coming from a traditional human-computer interaction background, has been to co-design the tool and its features throughout. So this is very much our focus on journalist engagement, going beyond just user-centered design and trying to involve and empower the journalists in the design process so that the tool actually does what they want it to do and embodies their knowledge and expertise rather than our interpretations of it. And as some of you may have experienced, working in and around newsrooms with technology and AI is occasionally challenging. And we, over the last 5 or 6 years, encountered many issues that I'm going to try and summarize in the first half of this keynote for you. And before people think I'm being unduly negative and throw back the retort, that's the way it is. My role at the university now is to front up a national centre for creativity enabled by AI. So we're working in lots and lots of sectors with lots and lots of experts, professionals using our tools to be more creative. Elite sports organisations such as football clubs and Olympic organisations, design, business consultancies. We've worked on manufacturing plants. So we have a kind of baseline of experiences with which to compare some of the issues that I think are probably more entrenched in news and media when it comes to rolling out AI and technologies. So these are very much neutral observations. I'm not taking a perspective that I'm being critical here. These are observations that I'm trying to present as objectively as possible as challenges that we face in the design or the co-design of technologies. So I'm just going to run through a few of these. The first one, which is a real issue in co-design, is that finding journalists to work with is difficult. They can be very scarce resources. They're often working to short daily deadlines. They're often working under pressure. There is insufficient staff in the offices to cover all of the stories. And when it comes to working with designers and even academics such as us, co-design work is low priority. So we struggled considerably to get journalists to engage with us in the co-design work. And I'll come on to other reasons why that might be a little later on. So the fundamental barrier to co-design is finding the journalists to work with. Even if you're successful in finding journalists to work with, journalists are not a homogeneous group. Unsurprisingly, they come from a representative range of society. But what has struck me is that even within a single newsroom, there is considerable diversity in the needs, the interests, the work practices. And I have wondered whether the nature of journalism, as, for example, opposed to professional football coaching or working in a manufacturing plant, It's a more individualistic piece of work. There are variations and individual traits and practices that journalists hold on to. And that creates barriers if you're trying to design something that is at least to be rolled out in a newsroom is a general product. So dealing with the idiosyncrasies and the very different needs of individual journalists and small groups of journalists is another barrier. Something else that we encountered, which I guess surprised me, but on hindsight shouldn't have, is that what journalists want, or at least what they wanted from the tools that we're developing, was quite different from what the editors were wanting. Our main focus in the JET product and the preceding research projects was to enhance the creativity of journalists, because we thought this would be a good thing, developing better stories that could get more reads and a larger number of hits and so on. It wasn't clear that many of the editors that we spoke to wanted the same thing. There was a greater focus on productivity and connectedness and competitiveness. So we faced a challenge in having to constantly argue for the case for greater journalist creativity could lead to journalist productivity and newsroom productivity. So be very aware that within a news organization, different stakeholders want different things. This is not such a surprise if you come at it from an information systems perspective, but it did surprise me, even in quite small news organizations where maybe there's only a dozen staff, these variations existed. Yes, Venus and Mars, journalists and designers. Our role was very much as a designer in this work. And whilst we were going in there in order to understand the work and the work practices of journalists so we could design a tool for them, there was generally very little understanding from the journalists that we work with as to why we were wanting to engage with them. Why did we need to interview them? Why did we need to look at some of the copy? Why did we need to understand what technologies they were using? As many people on this call or in this conference will recognize, design is complicated and requires considerable access to the problem domain and the stakeholders in it in order to design effective solutions. That was not widely understood in many of the news organizations that we engaged with. It was almost as if, you know, we could provide the solution without that understanding. And we had quite a few discussions about how to try and convince the news organizations and journalists that we needed to be in and amongst them for weeks at a time in order to fully understand their work practices, needs, and technologies. On top of all of this, once we were developing products, we found that there was very little time for learning curves within live news organizations. Even if we introduced a product to a small group of journalists working in one part of a news organization as a pilot, very rarely are you going to get a sophisticated piece of technology to function exactly as the journalists want it, certainly in the context of all the preceding obstacles that I've talked about. So we encountered relatively little patience and a tendency to reject capabilities, features, even the whole product very quickly if it wasn't delivering perceived value within a week. And that is very difficult to do when you're introducing a product. Trying to find spaces within certainly smaller news organizations where there is that sort of slack within the system to take on a learning curve is difficult and again, a barrier to take up. As well as these rather sort of more passive barriers or obstructions to designing and delivering AI technologies in newsrooms, we also encountered more active barriers. And one of the ones that we were surprised at, I suppose, but maybe in hindsight we shouldn't have been, was that stopping new newsroom technologies can be seen as a badge of honor by journalists and groups of journalists. It is something to be proud of because the technologies are seen as an intrusion into their ways of working, their professionalism. And this is a direct quote we got from one of our stakeholders when we were conducting interviews, and they were nice people. I mean, they weren't aggressive towards us, they were nice guys, but One of them said, we seem to have a certain stubbornness. We don't learn to use new, as they call them, data programs voluntarily, and especially not programs that don't work optimally when we start using them. So there was this sort of almost pride, and this was a group of journalists who took a certain pleasure in stopping the technologies being taken up in the newsroom. And as part of these interviews, one of them recounted a story that they'd probably been successful in stopping technologies for the last decade. So often you're up against a culture there which is resistant to what could be seen as degrees of automation and undermining existing professional work practices. And that kind of takes us into the sort of wider issues around AI. AI in journalism has been talked about quite a lot recently. It's probably been headlining for the last 5 years. We often encountered oversimplistic narratives around AI in newsrooms, largely coming down once you picked it apart. It wasn't always the first thing that was said, but once you started to pick apart what these technologies might do for the news organizations and the journalists, it came down to a perceived fear of automation leading to redundancies, loss of jobs, loss of power in the workplace. And I think this focus on automation rather than what we try to call it, which is augmentation, we can use technologies that can manipulate information and data so as to enhance your capabilities to upskill you, is something that has not been communicated effectively in many news organizations. We need, in some senses, one of the things I could do if I could wave a magic wand is remove this term AI, which is very poorly understood. There's a lot of work going on to try and unpick it and tease apart the different models of AI that are out there so that we can have a sort of refined understanding. But at the moment, we're still encountering these oversimplistic AI narratives, which in some quarters are kind of ironic because it's often the journalists who are contributing through to stories that they publish around these narratives. But it does act as a barrier due to the fear of automation. Another interesting theme that came out and was often cited as a barrier was your technology is not explainable. Now, there is an increasing recognition that AI needs to be explainable, or I should qualify this by saying that some AI technologies need to be explainable. And the inability of our tool to very concisely explain why it was generating interesting angles. So these were angles or takes on stories that the journalists recognized were valuable and interesting. But because the tool didn't explain to them in sufficient detail while it was generating them, that was deemed to be as a cause for rejection. And I can recall 2 or 3 news organizations where we ran demos and gave trials to where that happened. My take on this, that the need for AI to be explainable has become a bit of an oversimplistic truism in news organizations. Yes, we need to have AI that explains in some cases, but where a tool is, to a degree, simulating human creativity, and the journalist can perceive that the angle that's being generated is potentially valuable and novel and can create stories, why does the tool need to explain it? If you're in a morning editorial meeting and one of your colleagues comes up with a great idea, which everyone buys into, and in a period of flow, you work with it, you're not imposing that same strict constraint on the human journalist or editor who comes up with the same idea. So strangely, I think we're holding technology sometimes to unrealistic levels, which we don't hold our fellow colleagues to. And that has become almost a false barrier to some of the technologies being taken on. So I'm not decrying the need for explainability in some contexts, but I think we need to be very clear about when it needs to be explainable and frankly, when it doesn't. Something else we got quite a lot was, your tool doesn't look like Google. Now, one of the aspects of the creative intelligence that we had developed was around search. We would manipulate content around tens of millions of published news stories in order to find new angles. And the tool was then designed to present these angles back in ways that the co-designers suggested. The journalists, I think there was an interesting perception that we called the Googleization of news. That if the journalists weren't able to find something that they were looking for straight away, as they can with Google, that tended to become a reason to reject it. Our tool was never trying to be Google. It was suggesting we'll find you something that's similar but different to what you're writing about at the moment, to give you that sort of edge, that angle. But the fact that journalists' minds, they were able to compare it to Google and immediately say it doesn't want to do what Google does, therefore we're going to reject it, was interesting. And we took that as an example of a general cognitive bias towards a small set of tools that journalists tended to be working with in newsrooms that they found acceptable in their work and weren't varying too far from in their expectations. A couple of other points was simply the number of tools that are out there for journalists. I'm just taking a picture of a very full desktop here, in which if you're developing a new product and app, it often becomes one of a large number of tools that's out there. And increasingly, what we found when we were going into some newsrooms, maybe we were a couple of years too late, some news organizations are going, this looks quite interesting, but we've already committed to invest and develop a large number of tools over the last couple of years that our journalists are already struggling to deal with. And you want us to put another one on top of their pile, and one that we haven't actually developed ourselves. So often, even if you're able to overcome the issues of perceived value and to find people who might champion your case in the newsrooms, there was cause to reject, because too many other tools were in the pipeline for development and rollout. And my last barrier, before you all become too pessimistic about this sector and AI in it, and I will then be a bit more positive. One challenge that we experienced, particularly within small news organizations, and we've literally just encountered it again in the new rollout of JetAI, is that the news businesses with whom you reach agreements to roll out your technologies are not the businesses that manage the technology for the news organizations. Often let's call it the IT management of the technologies running in newsrooms is run by third-party organizations, either local IT businesses or larger organizations. And when you come in and reach an agreement with a news organization that they might deploy your technology, this causes an issue because this isn't part of the contract that the news organization has reached with the IT provider. So actually you'll find yourself in a three-cornered dialogue between the news organization and the IT provider, and there are also sometimes tensions there already, and the contractual structure that you're trying to deal with. So recognize that even if you get agreement within news organizations to deploy, you then have to deal with a third organization, which may actually result in contractual changes, further costs, and so on. So in spite of all of these barriers, we did actually have successfully launched a product. You can explore it online, and we were at least able to come up with some ways around some of these barriers. So I'm going to just spend the last 3 or 4 minutes going through some things that worked as practices that you might try. The first thing I'd suggest doing is simply dialing back on the AI element. This is more of interest sometimes to us technology people than it is to the journalists or the editors. It's just software that does something with data. The extent to which learning's going on in sort of true sense is often neither here nor there. There's a lot of AI in technologies that everyday technologies that journalists and editors would not consider threatening. So my advice is simply dial back on the AI and stress the sort of the wider usage capabilities and worry less about how it does it. Prepare different pitches for different parts of the news organization. Even within a small local newspaper, you may have to pitch to the journalists for around the creativity angle. You may have to pitch to the editor around the productivity angle. And again, you may have to pitch to the owner of the news business who may have to stump up the money to pay for your product, maybe around competitiveness and long-term investment. So recognize that even within small single news organizations, different pitches are required. We learned that the hard way, and it does take time. kind of an obvious one is you need your newsroom champions. Even within a large news organization, you're going to need 2 or 3 people who are buying into the product and what you're seeking to do as change within news organizations. So finding these people and investing in them heavily as part of your team was something that we did. We invited them to conferences and project meetings across Europe as part of their support for the project, just to demonstrate how much we valued them. And in terms of who the champions tend to be, it's not a surprise, I guess, that the younger journalists who are more open to new technologies tended to be those that were more likely to take on the tech. We did find in a number of news organizations there was quite a clear age/experience divide between the younger ones who wanted to change work practices and the older journalists who are quite resistant. So at least targeting the younger journalists as the easier wins to demonstrate potential buy-in was a way that we went about this. And buy-in journalists, that's not buy journalists, buy-in journalists, and recognize that if you want them to participate in the project and that you are requiring their time, they're unlikely to be able to offer that on top of their current workloads. If you're in the news organization, if they're employees, then it's probably a case of needing to offer funds to the news organization as part of a contract. Freelancers are an increasingly common user group for our product, and the only way we can really get them to be involved in product development and testing is to buy in their time. So recognize that it does cost to use journalists in projects. One of our ways of overcoming the yet another product or yet another tool problem was actually to start to design the JetAI tool as a plugin. So one of the things we've done is we've designed it as a plugin to a number of text editors that journalists are already writing in. And this overcame lots of issues around firewalls, IT security, and so on. So it's currently designed as a plugin in Google Chrome. It also works in Google Docs. It works in WordPress. It kind of pops up on the right-hand side here. You can see it as a pop-up rather than a web application. And we've also been working with a large Danish provider of content management system. So it's also a plugin now, at least tentatively, for a large commercial content management system that works in very much the same way. And we think this is an effective way of getting tools taken up within news organizations. So that was about 21 minutes of misery and a little bit of enlightenment at the end based on our experiences. It is what Carl Gustav asked me to talk about. If you think I put you in a bit of a downer at the end of your project. Let me just finish here with a list of these. If there are questions or comments, observations, critiques, I'm more than happy to discuss them here.